Encased in tempered steel and mounted on selectively bred war horses, armored knights represented the most advanced military technology of their age. For centuries, heavy cavalry charges shattered lightly armored troops and decided battles. To a modern audience, the knight can seem almost invulnerable. But this impression is not entirely accurate. On medieval battlefields, knights were brought down by soldiers with specialized weapons. Knights who appeared untouchable were beaten, broken, and killed, often at close range. But they were not defeated by chance or brute force alone. They were overcome through clever weapons and changes in battlefield tactics. So how did medieval soldiers defeat the most advanced warriors of their world? In this video, we'll examine the knight's weaknesses and the deadly techniques designed to exploit them. To begin, we'll look at the armor worn by knights in the 15th century, when their equipment reached its most advanced form. By the 15th century, most knights wore a full suit of armor made from tempered steel. This armor covered the entire body, and the plates were carefully shaped and articulated, allowing movement at the joints while still providing continuous protection. The helmet evolved into highly protective forms such as the houndskull bassinet or later the heavy armet, offering strong frontal defense but limiting vision and airflow. Beneath the plate, knights wore padded garments and chainmail to protect weak spots at the joints, such as the armpits and groin. The armor of this time was designed primarily to defeat cuts and stabs. Curved surfaces deflected sword strikes, while hardened steel resisted penetration. However, this protection had clear weaknesses. Peripheral vision was reduced, heat built up quickly, fatigue set in, and openings were often required for movement and breathing. By the 15th century, metallurgical advances in plate armor had made the slashing edge of a sword largely irrelevant. Consequently, we see a shift toward weaponry focused on crushing damage, like the mace and the warhammer. While it was largely impossible to slash through plate armor, the kinetic energy of a heavy object was enough to shatter bone protected behind the plate. A heavy, blunt strike against a helmet could often prove to be fatal. Such a blow could cause severe brain trauma without ever puncturing the steel. Unlike bladed weapons, these weapons required less precision. A swing to any armored limb could break bones. Knights on horseback often carried maces as secondary weapons to use once lances shattered, and infantry militia found them simpler to use than swords. By the 15th century, the mace was standard kit for anyone expecting to face plate-clad opponents. A mace of this period typically consists of a heavy metal or wooden shaft, featuring a head made of metal. The head of a mace was often shaped with flanges to increase the pressure of an impact by focusing the force on a small point. By adding vertical steel ridges or flanges to the head, the flanged mace guaranteed that the force of a swing was concentrated onto a very narrow strike line and improved effectiveness in the heat of combat. They would make clean contact on the armor instead of sliding around it, allowing them to deliver more force to an armored opponent than a traditional mace. A soldier in a chaotic melee fight needed a weapon that worked at any angle. This increased the mace's ability to injure an armored opponent through the armor. It could also dent plate armor itself. Such dents could bind overlapping plates and restrict movement. The warhammer rose as a popular weapon in the late medieval period. It became somewhat of a necessity in combat when armor became so strong that swords and axes were no longer able to pierce it. By 1395, French infantry deployed sophisticated warhammers equipped with thrusting tips, side flanges, and a spike. The back spike could be used for hooking a target's armor, reins, or shield. The blunt side of a warhammer was usually used to knock down and stun an enemy. And once the opponent was immobilized on the ground, the hammer was rotated around to hit the target with the pointed side. This could punch a hole straight through the helmet and deliver the killing blow. A powerful swing from a warhammer, especially with the spike, can deliver a strike force of several hundred kilograms per square millimeter, the same penetrating force as a rifle bullet. The length of the handle may vary, the longest being roughly equivalent to that of a halberd, which is roughly the length of a man, and the shortest about the same as that of a mace, 2 to 3 feet or 60 to 90 centimeters. Long war hammers were meant for use by foot soldiers, whereas shorter ones were primarily used by those mounted. The poleaxe was the multi-tool of the professional soldier. The design of the head varied greatly, with a variety of interchangeable parts and rivets. Generally, the head bore an axe head or hammer head, mounted on ash or other hardwood shafts, with a spike, hammer, or hook on the reverse. In addition, there was a spike or spearhead projecting from the end of the shaft. It was a close-range weapon that required one's full body strength and both hands to wield effectively. The poleaxe has a sophisticated fighting technique, which is based on quarterstaff fighting. The blade of the poleaxe can be used not only for simply hacking down the opponent, but also for tripping him, disarming him, and blocking his blows. At a quick glance, the poleaxe is often confused with the similar-looking halberd. While they may have both been designed for hacking and piercing through armor plates, the axe blade on a poleaxe seems to have been consistently smaller than that of a halberd. A smaller head concentrates the kinetic energy of the blow on a smaller area, enabling the impact to defeat armor, while broader halberd heads are better against opponents with less mail or plate armor. To allow for movement, a suit of armor consists of a series of moving parts which left gaps. Even the best-made harness left the armpits, the groin, and the vision slits vulnerable. We see in combat manuals from medieval times a technique called half-swording. By gripping the middle of their own blade, a swordsman shortened their weapon's lever, turning it into a stiff, two-handed spike. This provided the leverage necessary to guide the point into the articulated joints of an opponent's armor with accuracy. Some weapons may have been modified specifically for this purpose, sporting what is called a ricasso, which was an unsharpened part of the blade, used as a point of extra leverage in a thrust. The ricasso on larger swords, such as the two-handed sword, provided a long area more fitting for gripping during half-swording. Sometimes the weapon was reversed, turning the hilt into an improvised mace designed to inflict devastating head trauma. Once the fight reached the ground, which it frequently did, it became a grappling match. The primary tool for the killing blow was the Rondel Dagger. Note the lack of a cutting edge on this weapon. It is a needle-like spike with a reinforced triangular cross-section. It was designed for extreme stiffness, allowing it to be driven through chainmail links or directly into the visor. The Rondel Dagger evolved in the 14th century from the early knightly dagger of earlier centuries, matching the evolution of full-plate armor. By the 15th century, it had become the standard sidearm for knights and was often carried into battle. They were used to puncture and burst mail links. They could also penetrate weaker points in plate armor and helmets. This included thinner plates, gaps, and joints. The wide spherical pommel might have assisted by making it easier for the user to push or punch the point of the dagger into its target. As armor improved, puncturing in such ways was one of the only ways in which the heavy armor of knights could be breached. The contemporary post-mortem on the remains of King Richard III showed that at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, he suffered a sharp blow from a pointed weapon, such as a Rondel dagger, to the skull. They were a knight's backup weapon to be used in hand-to-hand fighting, and as such one of their last lines of defense. Since they were able to penetrate a suit of armor, Rondel daggers could be used to force an unseated or wounded knight to surrender and be kept for ransom. Keeping distance from the knight and bombarding them with arrows proved to be an effective way of reducing their dominance on the battlefield. The broadhead arrow was ineffective against chainmail and plate armor, and as a result the smaller bodkin point was developed. It was a stiff, chisel-shaped head made of hardened steel. While it could not reliably penetrate steel armor, its ability to concentrate pressure allowed it to burst chainmail rings at the joints, meaning that direct hits to gaps in the plate and to a knight's joints could be lethal. However, the primary purpose of an arrow barrage was likely to kill or injure the knights' horses, and to force the knights to brace behind shields or lower their visors to protect their eye slits. This, in turn, made them clumsier, reduced their visibility, and disrupted their organization during a charge. For even greater stopping power, the heavy crossbow had evolved during the centuries to produce greater arrow speeds in order to penetrate steel armor. They utilized a steel construction and a windlass to store immense potential energy. At close range, these square-headed bolts possessed the velocity to penetrate thinner sections of plate armor. Finally, we must consider the innovation that ultimately brought an end to the armored knight: gunpowder. Gunpowder slowly eroded the knight's military dominance between the 14th and early 16th centuries as weapons, tactics, and the structure of warfare changed. Early gunpowder weapons appeared in Europe in the early 13th century, but at first they posed little threat to heavily armored cavalry. Hand cannons and primitive firearms were slow, inaccurate, and unreliable, and well-made plate armor could often withstand their impact at normal battlefield ranges. During this period, knights remained effective as shock troops, and firearms were merely an auxiliary weapon rather than a decisive one. The balance began to shift in the 15th century as both technology and tactics improved. Firearms became more consistent and more powerful, capable of piercing plate armor at close range. At the same time, infantry tactics evolved. Armies increasingly relied on disciplined formations of pikemen supported by gunners, called the pike and shot formation, a combination that blunted cavalry charges and punished even the best of heavy cavalry. The famous Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where thousands of French knights were slain by the English, did not involve gunpowder weapons in a decisive role, but it demonstrated a crucial principle. Heavily armored nobles could be defeated by organized infantry using relatively inexpensive weapons. This lesson shaped military thinking across Europe. Artillery accelerated the decline of the knight by undermining the entire feudal system that sustained him. In the late 15th century, cannons became powerful enough to demolish the castle walls that had once guaranteed dominance of the nobles. As fortifications fell, so did the military and political foundations of the knightly class. Warfare increasingly favored centralized states that could fund artillery trains and standing armies rather than individual nobles bound by feudal obligations. By the early 16th century, the contest between armor and firearms was effectively over. Arquebuses and early muskets could reliably penetrate most battlefield armor, forcing soldiers to abandon full suits of plate in favor of partial protection such as breastplates and helmets. Cavalry did not disappear, but its role changed from armored shock combat to reconnaissance, flanking, and pursuit. The decisive moment often cited is the Battle of Pavia, where Spanish infantry armed with firearms destroyed French heavy cavalry, killing or capturing much of the noble elite. In short, gunpowder defeated the heavily armed knight through a century-long process. As firearms improved and infantry tactics matured, the knight's armor, training, and social status could no longer guarantee battlefield superiority. By the mid-16th century, the fully armored knight had become a relic of an earlier age, replaced by armies built around gunpowder, discipline, and centralized state power. Your support means a lot to us. If you would like us to continue making videos of this sort, consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. What topic would you like to see covered next? As always, sources and further reading can be found in the description.